Negative gearing in the housing market is a political football in any tax debate, even bigger than GST, you could argue. So it was a surprise last week to see leaks about possible changes under review. Well, earlier I was joined by two chief economists with very different views, Harley Dale with the Housing Industry Association and Saul Eslake at Bank of America Merrill Lynch, who was in Melbourne. Gentlemen, welcome to the business.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Saul Eslake, I'll start with you. Do you think that this leak that came out about the Treasury possibly working on restricting negative gearing to new residences only was a bit of kite flying by government ahead of the budget?
I have no idea, Tiki. I mean, governments always leak things in the weeks leading up to the budget. Sometimes it's with a view to testing the public reaction before they make a final decision. Sometimes it's because they actually have made a decision. They want to get the bad news out of the way so that when people do see the budget on budget night, the reaction is more of a, whew, it wasn't as bad as we thought it could have been. Or so the Treasurer can focus on things that he think will be more politically positive for him than the things that have been leaked in advance. I mean, this isn't the first time over many years that pre-budget speculation has included talk of this nature, so I will simply wait and see whether the Treasurer announces anything to that effect on budget night.
And Saul Eslake, just how much of a difference could reducing negative gearing make, do you think?
Well, it depends on what they do. If they do anything, I'm pretty sure they will grandfather people who are already availing themselves of negative gearing, not least because there are 1.2 million Australians, or almost 13% of individual taxpayers, who are doing that, and I don't think the government could afford to make them as angry as taking their negative gearing provisions away probably would. The speculation has suggested that the government might restrict the availability of negative gearing from budget night onwards to investors in new housing. And while that would, from one perspective, be a distortion, in particular, it would be arguably unfair from the perspective of those who choose between property and other assets, such as shares, bonds, commodities and the like.
Yes, because there's negative gearing for those as well.
Well, that's right, although usually lenders won't lend as much for people who invest in those financial assets as they will for property. But yes, this was one of the assertions that was made when negative gearing was temporarily suspended for all property investors back in the mid-1980s, and that's one of the very few assertions about it at the time that actually has some truth in it, in my view.
Let me bring Harley Dale in here, because Harley Dale, what do you worry about if a reduction of the availability of negative gearing is in fact on the table?
Well, let me start by saying I think it's unlikely it probably is in the current budget environment, given that we do have a white paper on taxation coming up at some point in the current federal election
Nevertheless,
term.
this leak must
would seem unusual, but I think one of the key points is what Saul's already pointed out, and that is that negative gearing provisions do apply to a range of asset classes, not just residential property. Now, granted, with the debate we have in Australia, you'd often be mistaken for thinking it only applied to residential property, because that's where the focus lies. But were you to amend negative gearing provisions, hypothetically, on residential property without taking account of other asset classes, then you would be lowering Australian living standards, because you would be placing an additional distortion on the tax system.
What would its impact be?
Well, I think its impact would potentially be quite large, because at the current point in time we already have a housing sector that is very heavily taxed. You know, if you look at the average tax burden on new housing, for example, it's about 31% of activity, as opposed to about 24% across the economy as a whole. So I don't necessarily think you get this simplistic outcome, if you like, where if you tinker with negative gearing on residential property, you get the kind of outcomes that we often hear about, the automatic, more affordable housing, the boost to supply. I think it's somewhat more complicated than that.
Saul Eslake?
Well, I probably diverge a bit from Harley here. While I think excluding negative gearing from investment in established property, as the pre-budget leaks are suggesting, would introduce an additional distortion. It would just be one more on what's already a pretty distorted field. I don't accept the proposition that's commonly made that the availability of negative gearing does boost the supply of housing, or indeed contributes much at all to improving housing outcomes for Australians. That's partly because over 90% of geared investors, whether they're negatively or positively, purchase established housing, so they almost by definition push up the price of existing dwellings in competition with borrowers who are looking to buy their own homes.
How do you respond to that, and indeed to the accusation that this is more about the land banks on behalf of your members that you're really worried about?
Yeah, look, quite frankly, I just don't accept that. I think it's quite clear that there is a certain progressive way in which we can make housing more accessible and more affordable for both renters and owner-occupiers, and that is firstly to address the major distortions that exist in the market, and they relate to admittedly some very difficult challenges in and around a lack of readily available land supply and some very inefficient taxation in the form of stamp duty on residential property conveyances, for example. I think these are the areas where we would get our bang for our buck in terms of amending current policy settings. Granted, I know there is a lot of conjecture out there that current negative gearing provisions boost the pressure, if you like, on existing property prices. But generally speaking, with or without negative gearing, you tend to get a trend where when you've got a cyclical recovery, investors enter the market first, trade up owner-occupiers follow them, and entry-level buyers come along behind. We're in the second of those two at the moment, and there are some unique instances why first home buyer numbers look historically quite low at the moment.
What about Saul Eslake's argument that really negative gearing is very much about the investment in the existing property market rather than new homes?
Well, the figures bear out the fact that over the last decade or so, Saul's quite right that the share is overwhelmingly in favour of existing property, but you have got these very large distortions on new property that are a disincentive to invest there anyway. When on average across the capital cities in Australia, 40% of a final new home price goes on fees, taxes and charges across local, state and federal government. You've got an inherent bias there anyway. You still need to fix the supply side of the market, I would argue.
Saul Eslake, this was one of the things that Ken Henry, I think, did say, that really you've got to fix the land access issue first, the land release issue first, before you start playing around with negative gearing.
Yes, I know Ken Henry's review said something like that, but I think Ken Henry might have paid more attention to the arguments that are put by defenders of negative gearing than their intellectual merit would have justified.
Oh, you think that,
in this instance. Yeah, I do. I mean, I certainly agree with Harley and others who say that a major problem in the Australian housing supply chain are the blockages that are created by state and local government planning laws and infrastructure charging policies and the like, and I would be as keen as Harley and others are to see reforms of that nature in there, although they are a state and local government responsibility rather than primarily a federal one. The federal government is responsible for the taxation system, and I simply make the point that although negative gearing has become much more attractive since the Howard government halved the rate of capital gains tax in '99, which had the effect of turning negative gearing from a strategy that traditionally was only about deferring tax to one which allows people both to defer and permanently reduce the amount of tax they pay. Despite that, the housing shortage has gotten more acute over the last decade or so. The vacancy rate in Australia has consistently been below 4% for the last 10 years, whereas in countries that don't have negative gearing like the United States, the vacancy rate has never been below 7%. So whether you look at Australian history or you look at comparable countries overseas, there's absolutely zero evidence to suggest that negative gearing does anything to to boost the supply of rental housing. And I would argue, in defence of the measures that have been speculated about in the press, although I don't know whether that speculation's well-founded, that if you denied negative gearing to investors in established dwellings, that would at least at the margin skew investors towards purchasing new dwellings, and that would at least have a more reasonable basis for asserting that it would do something to boost the supply of housing and would be good for Harley Dale's members, I would think.
Harley Dale?
Well, look, I would agree that at the margin, there is a good chance that you would boost new housing supply, but with the long-standing rigidities that exist on the new housing supply side of the market, you're still going to run headlong into this lack of ability to provide sufficient new housing supply to have both enough rental property and enough owner-occupier property into the future. So while you might construct, say, a hypothetical situation where you only put negative gearing provisions applying to new property, and maybe we get some whiz-bang reform, which means we're addressing lack of available land supply, and we do something about the inefficient taxes. If you put all that together, you'd probably get some modest gain from the negative gearing provision that might give you, a little bit less than $100 million in economic dividend, if you like, a year. But the residential land supply is going to give you a dividend of probably $1.5 billion a year. Addressing stamp duty, for example, would give you a multi-billion-dollar dividend. I don't think if we want to succeed in adequately and affordably housing our growing population, I don't think negative gearing is where the main game's at.
All right. Let me ask Saul Eslake about the transition if we did move to take out negative gearing. There's a lot of talk about grandfathering, but that might encourage existing investors to hold on to their investment properties for more than the current 3 to 4 year churn. It has been suggested that instead you go for limiting the losses as part of the amount of negative gearing that you could use. What do you make of that?
Well, that's a possible suggestion that I'd have to think through. I mean, in an ideal world, you would abolish negative gearing, including for those who have it already, but politically that's unrealistic because there are 1.2 million of these folks and they vote. So no government is going to do that.
Well, it's been tried before.
When it was tried before, they didn't take it away from people who already had it, as I understand, and there's a lot of mythology about what actually happened to rents during that period, which is used by people who defend negative gearing and which, when you look at the figures, has absolutely no foundation in practice at all. I mean, I imagine if the government were to do something along the lines that's been publicly suggested in the budget, it would be similar to the announcement and introduction of the capital gains tax by Paul Keating in 1986. That is, when that announcement was made, it said that there would be no capital gains tax applied to assets which people held at that point in time, but any assets bought after that time were subject to capital gains tax. In the same way, if the government is to do this in the forthcoming budget, I'm sure the Treasurer would say something like people who are already in negatively geared investments can keep their entitlements, but from tonight onwards, no purchase of an established dwelling for an investment purpose will be eligible for negative gearing. Only the purchase of new dwellings or ones that have been constructed within a certain period are eligible for that concession. And yes, there's a distortion that arises from that, but compared with the ultimate advantages to the taxation system of gradually winding back negative gearing, that's a small price, I think, to pay.
All right. And Harley Dale, can I ask you finally, some people think there's something wrong with negative gearing to the extent that you're actually rewarding investors for carrying losses and waiting for growth.
Yes, it's an interesting argument, that, in the sense that if we look at negative gearing in a holistic sense and recognise the fact it's not just on residential property, at the current point in time, under current policy settings, it's an integral part of Australia's taxation system, where you have assessable income and you have outgoings that are deductible, and you look at your outgoings and your losses and you come up with an assessable income, and if if you want to have a conversation about the appropriateness or otherwise of negative gearing provisions in Australia, then fine, let's have this conversation. But let's have this conversation in the holistic way. Let's not have it just purely focused on one asset class, albeit admittedly the largest asset class that benefits from it. But let's have a look at all the asset classes to which the taxation system applies in that regard.
Maybe they just might do that. Saul Eslake and Harley Dale, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having us, Tikki.
My pleasure.